My name is Betty Cruz, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. Thank you for being here tonight. We're so excited to be partnering with City Theater, who's hosting the space, and I'm going to invite James to say a few words in a minute and welcome us to the Lilly Theater. And to our partners on the program, the Alliance for Securing Democracy and Pitt Cyber as well. But first up, James, why don't you say a few words about the City Theater?
Thank you, Betty, and good to see everybody. Welcome to City Theater. I'm the managing director here. My name is James McNeil. I use he, him pronouns. And we're just thrilled to be able to host this with the World Affairs Council and all of you to be here. We are in the Dr. Vanell Audrey Watson Lilly Theater, and this is a new name for this space for us. We renamed it in May in honor of Dr. Lilly, who passed away a couple of years ago. But just a little bit about her, because I think she is truly one of the titans of the American theater. She was a leader in the Black theater movement, and she was the founder of the Cantu Repertory Theater, which performed here in Pittsburgh over about 20 years in the 80s and 90s. City Theater worked closely with Cantu and with Dr. Lilly on about a dozen productions over that time. And after she passed away, we realized that there actually wasn't a lot of recognition for her here in Pittsburgh. She was at the University of Pittsburgh for many years, and we wanted to honor her. So in May, we decided to rechristen this space in her name and make sure her legacy lives on, because she truly was a pioneer in the field. For those of you who don't know City Theater, we're going into our 48th season this year. We have an incredible season lined up. Apropos to tonight, we're doing Heidi Schreck's What the Constitution Means to Me, which we really encourage everyone. That play, unfortunately, has become very much even more relevant than it was in the recent past. So we encourage you to check that out in the entire season. But truly, it's just an honor to have you all here to work with you, Betty, and your team. Community is one of our core values, and this very much fits into that. So it's great to have you here, and really look forward to the discussion. So thanks for being up here. Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you, James. Yes, please. A round of applause to speak. So again, I'm with the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, and our work is really about bringing people together around global issues. Our mission is to convene and connect people around global issues to build a thriving, competitive, and more inclusive region. And the reason, our why for all of this, our vision, is because we want to build a more globally minded and globally connected world that's just and equitable for all. And we can't do this alone. This is why we need everyone here and community, and to tackle big topics that we're going to today around misinformation and disinformation. Now, before jumping into today's program, we also want to acknowledge, for everyone joining us online and everyone who's here with us, that we are located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, including the Seneca, Lenape, Osage, and Shawnee, among many others. Through this acknowledgement, we invite you to join us in paying respect to the elders, both past and present. Now, with that, let's get into today's program. Again, so grateful to be partnering with the Alliance for Securing Democracy, with Pitt Cyber as well, for today's conversation on the rise of mis and disinformation and its effects on PA voters. This program is the first in a two-part conversation. We're going to be in Westmoreland County tomorrow night, so please join us if you can there. We're going to have a roundtable at the YWCA of Westmoreland County to talk about how authoritarian governments are influencing PA elections. Again, both very timely, important conversations. Now, we are honored to welcome Dr. Lara Putnam, who's going to lead today's conversation as our moderator. Lara is the University Center for International Studies research professor in the Department of History at the University of Pittsburgh. She's also the co-lead of the Southwest PA Civic Resilience Initiative of the Pitt Disinformation Lab. She researches social movements and political participation in local, national, and transnational dimensions, with particular attention to the ways that social media have changed the landscape of what we learn and who we trust. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Lara to lead today's conversation.
Thank you, Betty. And thank you all for being here. And special thanks, of course, to the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and Pitt Cyber for hosting this important discussion. We have about 90 minutes together, and I'll be in dialogue with our panelists to get us started. And then we're going to turn it over to you, our audience, for questions so that we can make this as much of a conversation as possible. And we'll have mics going around at that point when we move into the Q&A. And then we'll have some time at the end for everyone to mingle and connect some more informally and one-on-one or in small groups. But let's get right into it now. It's great to be here tonight with Morgan, David, and Rachel. I'm going to introduce each of you super briefly, and then I'm going to turn it to you to bring to life your work in this area and talk about why this issue is important in the work that you do and in your world. Here with us tonight is Rachael Dean Wilson, who is the head of external affairs and midterm elections lead at the Alliance for Security and Democracy. David Salvo serves as the deputy director of the Alliance for Security and Democracy and as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And Morgan Overton, in addition to being a community leader and advocate, it also serves as vice chair of the Allegheny County Democratic Committee. So first of all, thank you all for being here. And let's dive in. So let's start by going down the line. Rachael, let's start with you and have you introduce yourself a little more in a fuller way.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, and thank you, Pittsburgh Affairs Council, Pitt Cyber, Laura. Thank you for moderating. We're so excited to be here. I'm Rachael Dean Wilson. I'm the head of external affairs at ASD. My colleague Dave here. And I'm the lead on our midterm elections work. And so what that means is I'm taking all the issues. We look at threats, right? We look at threats from autocratic actors. And what that used to mean, what our main focus was Russia, China, and Iran. We are still looking at that, but also we have other domestic kind of actors with autocratic tendencies that are using the same tools and tactics. And so for these midterms, it makes a lot of sense to talk about what those tools and tactics are, how you're targeted with mis and disinformation, what that looks like, because the theory of change is if you know the tools and tactics used, you can better be on the lookout for them and decide for yourself as far as what you want to engage with and believe and share. But just that it provides more of a tool for all of our consumers ahead of elections to be on the lookout for. So a little bit more about my professional background. I come at this from politics and government. So I worked on and off for Senator John McCain for about 6 years, and really he instilled in me, or kind of, I've always had it, but really fostered this belief that U.S. democracy is good for the people who live in it, and it's good for people around the world. And we've had lots of challenges the last couple of years, to put it lightly, but we can still be that, and I think that this kind of work and these kind of discussions are critical to that. Pass it over to Dave.
Great, it's good to see all of you. Thanks for joining us. As already has been said, I'm the deputy director of the Alliance for Security and Democracy. That's less important than the fact that I sort of studied Russia as a profession. I've been doing that for about 20 years since my time as an undergrad. But I spent several years living and working and studying in Russia, and that's why I came to the Alliance when we first launched back in the summer of 2017, when we were predominantly looking at the Russian threat to democracy, not just in the United States, but the same threat that all of our European allies face as well. The threat environment has evolved, obviously, since 2017, but Russia is still very active and informs a lot of what Rachael and I and our team do at the Alliance. And it's troubling to see a lot of domestic actors here in the States, but also in other established democracies, emulating the tools and tactics that the Russian regime has used against us for quite some time now. So that intersection, that nexus of foreign and domestic malign actors is very much at the heart of what we look at today as the threat ecosystem has evolved. As someone who saw how the Russians use these tools up close in their own country against their own people, to see them now not only directed at us, but to see Americans using those tactics against each other, it's disheartening. And though I know we'd like to get to points of optimism at some point in this conversation, this is a long process. And regimes like Russia know that we are now sort of weaponized against ourselves. And that's very much at the heart of today's conversation, but also what we're facing as a nation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Overton. My pronouns are she and her. And as mentioned, I just became elected as the vice chair of the Allegheny County Democratic Committee, or ACDC for short. We aren't the band. And if you aren't aware of the ACDC, essentially it is committee members, or in other words, everyday residents here across the county who we hope to activate to be organizers of democracy in their own communities, where they've built trust, where they know how their community operates. And out of 2,600 seats, we have about half of those filled. So imagine what could happen if we do harness the individual power for good, for sustainable good. And we're in such a time where the urgency of now is so clear, and we are in such a window of opportunity that we don't have to repeat history, and we see history happening over the past 2 years. So, what are the tools and resources with reliable information that we can give people to sustain the next generation? And that's just the long and the short of it. But this work is incredibly personal for me. I'm a 5th generation Pittsburgher. I'm both Black and Native American. So it's been my calling ever since I could remember. I remember getting into arguments with classmates on the school bus in 4th grade about elections in 2004. And it's like, who does that when they're kids? So something was in me. So my goal is to activate the other Little Morgans across the county and hopefully beyond, to know that they do have a voice in the electoral process, but also to be an advocate in their respective communities and beyond. So I'm excited for this conversation.
Thank you all. Let's start with you with a sort of framing question, which maybe sounds sort of simple, but addresses some of the confusion that we encounter on these issues. So what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? And why do state actors like Russia, China, and Iran benefit from disinformation, misinformation, and maybe the fuzziness between them?
Sure. Very quickly, the primary difference between misinformation and disinformation is in the intent of the actor sharing or spreading that information. I'll give a quick example. An example of disinformation would be back in the 2016 campaign, Russian state-sponsored actors were sending text messages to American voters, misleading them on how and where to vote. So, essentially telling them you could vote by text, or election days on Thursday. There was a clear intent there to deliberately mislead the American voter. Now, let's say the person who got that text message went to their parents and said, "Hey, voting's on Thursday," or you could text your vote into this number. That would be an example of misinformation. It's false information, but the intent is not deliberately to deceive. So that's the primary difference between the two. Now, why do governments, authoritarian governments like Russia, China, Iran, and others use information as weapons, essentially? It's primarily to create, or, well, in some cases not create, but exacerbate an information environment of chaos, where nobody really knows what is fact or fiction. There's no agreement on sort of a base level set of facts, as I think we all recognize from public discourse in the United States today. So it's a very easy way for foreign adversaries of our country to use a very cheap tactic, the cheap currency against us. I think that's, in a very sort of short soundbite, simplistic way, that's why this information tactic is so part and parcel of the authoritarian toolbox against democracies like us.
So then, Rachael, given that mis and disinformation encompasses more than just outright lies, at the same time, there's so many different routes through which individuals could come to an unsupported conclusion, could come to trust an untrustworthy source, or could mislead others, not by saying something which is intentionally false. So how do we recognize mis or disinformation, either that we're hearing firsthand or that we want to critique elsewhere in the public sphere? How do we use our discernment for ourselves and for people within our communities?
No, that's a great question. And it's even more complicated in that if you want to add in malinformation, which is this, incredibly kind of amorphous term that is somewhat problematic in that it can mean so many things, but it's true information, but with the intent to mislead and harm. And so kind of a cut and dry example of that that we've encountered is back in right at the beginning of the pandemic. Foreign actors would write on their state-backed media outlets, write about a doctor in Florida who died 2 days after getting his COVID vaccine. And then they would have a totally factual article, but it was raising questions about it wasn't because of the vaccine, you know, quoting people with conspiracy theories. And at the end, it was like, you know, it was decided that it had nothing to do with the vaccine. So like, that's all fine and well, but it's still misleading. It's still harmful or potentially to your health. And so we add that in the mix. It's even more confusing. But I think what's actually quite positive about this is that the individual, it's positive, and then when you realize you can only control your behavior, I think it can also get overwhelming. But you actually have a lot of control in how you are taking in information, and that's critical to really identifying mis and disinformation and being thoughtful about it. So first of all, just being mindful with your diet of information. You know, we have more information, access to information at our fingertips than anyone in human history right now. All of us do, and that is incredible, but it's also can be potentially problematic depending on how you spend your time with that information and what you use it for. So I think being purposeful would be the first thing in how you consume information, where you're going for those sources. The second one is being kind of on your toes when consuming news. I think the first tried and true tactic as far as getting a successful disinformation campaign is going to be an emotional campaign of some sort. They want you to really be riled up. And so that's gonna being on the lookout for that. If you feel that emotion, like check that. Being self-aware. And then finally, I would always, particularly before you share anything or really take it to like part of your, you know, political arguments you're going to folks with, you know, check it. So Google it. It's not foolproof. You know, we can talk to you about the ways that you can kind of, you know, work around Google search or fill that, but it's going to help. So if you can see from another reputable outlet that that's the safe story, that those facts are correct. Those are just a few of the things that you can do and be on your guard with and be a better consumer of information and hopefully share.
Morgan, let me ask you, in terms of local impact or local presence, what have you seen either in concerns about that people bring to you about misinformation or disinformation, or in patterns of misinformation and disinformation that are impacting communities locally? And, you know, maybe whether you're answering wearing your Allegheny County Democratic Committee hat or your activist hat or your artist hat, your educator, your leader.
There's a lot of hats
going on.
I saw it was Mark Simpson earlier because I wear so many hats. All of these intersect one another, right? And I think when you take a step back, this information at large is so overwhelming. But there aren't enough checks and balances out there to help someone become a discerning or critical thinker. And, you know, we hear about internal and implicit bias, right? So if someone sees something on social media and they already have a thought in how they perceive the world, then they see somebody else mirror the same thought. It's like, that must be true because they said it, but then there's nothing out there to be like, well, hold on a second. Let's just unpack this for a minute. So when you add this on a political level, people already feel as though politics is out of reach, it's so overwhelming, they aren't looking out for my best interest. And none of this is new, what we're talking about. This is over the course of time, right? But, you know, again, when I think about my hat as the vice chair, how do we activate people with reliable tools and resources to make options, to have choices, to make on their own, but hopefully for good, again, right? So people often come to me on election day and they're like, who should I vote for? I don't know who these people are. And it's like, oh, that's kind of not good that you don't know who these people are, because are you overwhelmed by information? Are you just turned off by it? Do you feel like you're not invested in? And even just in 2020, when we were dealing with a reckoning of racial justice, people came to me saying, how can I get activated? How can I get involved? I'm like, well, it's not just one answer, but how do we activate people to share that information? And information is the key word here. It's not just a cliche, but like you said, Google is at our fingertips, right? You know, how do we direct them in the right direction so that they can make an informed decision and hopefully activate the people that they have access to? So I feel like my general thought is, for any systems of influence, people who influence people, it's incumbent on them to provide reliable, accessible information, because access is a whole other discussion that could be a panel within itself. So it's a lot of culminating factors. But again, that's why discussions like this are so important, to make it personal for people, because again, it just feels like, why would I even think about democracy when really it's near and dear to who we are and how we operate. So
Absolutely, and let's move to some of those sort of concrete examples of the ways that false claims or misleading claims move from the international or social media channels into to have an impact within, concrete impact within communities.
mm-hmm.
So Dave, let me pass this over to you. I think most of us are sort of generally familiar with some of the dimensions of the story of Russian influence in the 2016 election. But can you talk about the evolution of information operations from 2016 to now? Maybe pausing to talk a little bit about 2020.
Sure.
And how a threat to democracy moves from false claims to very real actions.
Sure. I mean, we could spend 2 hours just talking about what the Russian government did in the 2016 presidential election. And
we spent 2
2
years.
years studying just that. I will attempt to be as succinct as I can. I mean, the Russian government campaign targeting the 2016 election was extremely sophisticated because of their ability to really micro-target the American electorate. They know us extremely well. So they would tailor specific types of information tactics to target specific segments of the American electorate. Back then, a lot of their campaign was run through the sort of like bots and trolls that we've become familiar with through like the Internet Research Agency, the Troll Factory based out of St. Petersburg. That was sort of the primary vector of Russian information operations targeting the United States 6 years ago now. Those campaigns still exist. For example, what the Russian trolls would do is they would set up fake local news accounts online and pump out very benign sort of local community related news, local weather, sports, and then they would inject either, to use the terms that Rachael brought up, or like malinformation, maybe something true on, let's say, Ukraine or Syria, or something that was important to the Kremlin, but not necessarily important to people in Kansas City. And they would inject those narratives into these fictitious accounts on Twitter or Facebook, where they would worm their way into organic communities on Facebook, as we were talking before the event, and seed pro-Kremlin narratives and sometimes outright disinformation on issues like COVID, for example. These were ways of sort of exacerbating the poisonous information environment that sort of already existed in the United States. Now in 2020, you have a lot more happening in the overt dimension, the open dimension. So Russian state-sponsored media is sort of the primary threat actor. Yes, bots and trolls exist, but they're not as insidious as sort of the mouthpieces of the Kremlin, who are just outright sort of trashing the state of American democracy, Not all of that is disinformation, of course. Some of that is very, very real. But what's happening is you now have domestic voices in the United States who are megaphones of these same narratives. And it's not like they're on the Russian payroll or that they're taking instructions from the Kremlin. That's not the point. The point is that a lot of these narratives began 5,000 miles away. They are now being picked up by organic domestic voices here in the United States and gaining traction, not through fringe media or fringe accounts, but in the mainstream information ecosystem. And so in many respects, we're doing the work for Russia now. So in 2020, you did not see the same type of sophisticated state-run campaign against our election that you saw in 2016. That's not to say that there weren't attempts made to influence American voters in 2020. There were, but they were not even close to what's documented in the Mueller report, for example. And I would expect the same in 2022 and in 2024 even. There will be attempts by Russian government actors to influence the American electorate, but as long as we are at our own throats, that is the ultimate victory of the 2016 Russian campaign, by the way. People always used to ask me, did the Russians really care who won that election? Were they happy that Donald Trump won? Yeah, they were happy, but was that the overarching strategic objective of the Russian campaign? No, because they never went into that thinking that Donald Trump would win. They wanted us to be tearing each other apart. And here we are 6 years later doing exactly that. Whether Trump runs again or not, we're tearing each other apart. And that is the Russian victory. And they don't have to put their thumb on the scales to the same extent that they did 6 years ago.
And Rich, I want you to talk some more about 2020 and up to the present, because in that election in particular, the question of election administration and disinformation around not just sort of, who you should support of this actor or this actor, but very specific claims about the insisting that our election administration is untrustworthy.
Right.
Really came to the fore.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Lawson. So talk us through that and, what was new, what was impactful, and where are we now?
I mean, first of all, new, a nominee or a sitting president who lost an election refused to concede. That's new. And instead launched a disinformation campaign against our own election systems. I mean, that in and of itself is a pretty remarkable thing. So that is not something I think even Russia could have dreamed of in their wildest dreams back in 2016. But that's where we found ourselves. And what was interesting about 2020 is it was the rhetoric and the disinformation campaign that found supporters and a home, but it was up against an election system that didn't buy into that for the most part. Like, it kind of stood its ground. I mean, you saw in Georgia, Republicans there, Raffensperger, and they really stood up to this and said, no, we had free and fair elections. I mean, CISA, Trump's own Department of Homeland Security, declared it the most secure elections in history. So you had a system that really was able to technically stand up to a disinformation of that magnitude. We still saw the kinetic result of that clearly on January 6th. That luckily, I mean, thankfully failed. That is to show that, I mean, in very immediate terms, like, there are some disinformation campaigns where, like, you don't really see that for a while. This was almost rapid to a very physical manifestation of it. But what I think that means for these midterms is that now we have a political debate and an election system and administration that's primed for any irregularities, any kind of fraud, to highlight that and politically speaking, frame it. And I don't adhere to the idea that, like, everyone in one party is going to do that, or I think we have to look at this in as nuanced a way as it is. But that we do have candidates out there that are willing to go there, that it is now almost an established political tactic which is a very dangerous place to be. And at the end of the day, like I've worked on political campaigns, I totally get it. Like you are there to win. That is your job. But we always have lines because at the end of the day, you're there for democracy. You're there for the United States, and that was part of you had to know when to call it, and we've lost that line. And so that is, I could go, now we're looking at insider threats as one of the big threats to the 2022 election. So the actual election officials or administrators or even just poll workers that have, that buy into this, this idea of widespread election fraud. And one of what I always like to say is that no elections are perfect. These are human run endeavors. So there will be mistakes, but we need to have a system that allows us to identify those mistakes and then correct them. And I think that's what you see when these irregularities come up, but then it also feeds into a narrative. So I will end there. I think you could tell I could talk about that piece of it all night.
Well, and you helped us understand some of the incentives and the possibilities and maybe the temptations facing now political actors as, we've already gone through an election cycle that left some really fierce legacies of politicized disinformation. But what if we shift from thinking about political actors to think about the communities that are hearing and trying to make sense of an array of different claims? And here I want to go over to you, Morgan, because one thing that we've been really thinking about and trying to grapple with in the Disinformation Lab is questions of trust and trustworthiness, and the fact that different communities have very different experiences, historical, personal, biographical experiences of untrustworthy authorities in some cases, of authoritative voices that actually are not accurately reflecting a community's experiences or community's best interests. So there's not a single story of how disinformation is perceived. There really, our sense is that there's a real variety of different kinds of community experiences that shape who's trusted and why. And I know you professionally work across so many different communities within the city and within the region. So what do you see?
That's a loaded question. Oh my gosh, where do I begin? Well, I mean, it goes without saying that the trustworthiness needs to happen on a molecular level, to your point, right? All of these truths can coexist. But what happens when we actually harness the fact that people of lived experiences across intersections have a place in this process, right? That we can have a representative democracy. What does that look like, and why can't we reimagine that? Because for so long, and I guess this is my call to action to enter this work, for so long it did not look like me, sound like me, think about me, care about me. There were policies in place that said I was 3/5 of a human at one point. So it's like, why the heck would you even engage at this point? But it's that sort of power at that molecular level that I think is so profound when you have people who are thinking about the seventh generation. In Native American culture, there's something called the seventh generation principle, where you have to be mindful of the actions you take today and how it can impact 7 generations from now. And what gives me hope are the people who, because of this overwhelming variety of overwhelming experiences that we've seen over the past 6 years, there are people who have not, they're not shying away from that, but if anything, it's making them want to step up and counter that and be that fortified force that you were talking about, right? And I think that's what gives me hope, because I'm like, well, great, I'm not alone. But that's what it's going to take for people with multiple identities, multiple truths to be part of this process and to reclaim that and to cultivate that trust together. And it's not going to be easy, but that's why, again, I think the communities I have access to and in my role through the ACDC is incredibly important, because growing up in Penn Hills, for example, I never felt like I had access to that space. again, because I look like me, it sound like me. So now this is my chance to open this window of opportunity for everybody. But again, that trust building, it's going to take some time. And like I said, you have to make it personal for people. You have to allow them to see themselves. And hopefully that at least will trigger a domino effect that we are having the same conversation in 2024 or so on and so forth. If we are, then we have a problem. It's gonna show up in different ways, of course, because it's so in the roots and the weeds, but that's why you gotta empower people with knowledge to dismantle that.
Yeah, let me throw that sort of similar question to Rachael or Dave. Either of you, when you look comparatively, nationally and internationally, when we think about it, again, questions of trustworthiness and the experiences of marginalization or disempowerment that may shape differential vulnerability, or that may make different communities resonate with claims about conspiracies, or that may make different communities resonate with arguments that they should turn away from the system entirely. Is that something that we see more broadly as a pattern in disinformation and misinformation?
I can speak to some of the international examples of that. If you look at countries that have been particularly successful at inoculating their citizenry from the threat of disinformation, it's countries that are more homogenous than ours, for example. It's countries that sort of have a shared identity, shared history, shared cultural heritage. And I don't say that like that's better than our multicultural. That's not what I mean. I'm just saying if you look at countries like Sweden or I think a European nation that's sort of ethnically homogenous for the most part, they are very good at beating back, especially foreign disinformation threats. But if you take a country with an ethnic minority or a segment of the population that feels marginalized, and I'll use the Russia example. In the country of Estonia, for example, or Latvia, the Baltic states, former Soviet republics, they're ethnic Russian minorities. And the Russian government will target those populations to heighten a sense of grievance. And it's harder in those segments of the population to sort of create maybe a shared narrative of the present moment or the past, to be able to beat back again, those disinformation campaigns that the Russian government is using to sort of sow divisions in those countries. So, it's because we are a country that is just so diverse, and there isn't necessarily a common narrative of our past or our present or our future. It's hard. I don't say that to be fatalistic, but I think the United States just has a much more surmountable, or it has a much more difficult challenge to try to surmount because of that diversity that we have, which is a strength. But in this case, it's I don't want to call it a weakness. It's a challenge. Yeah.
And I would just add to that. I think for Russia, that's been division is always a goal and always beneficial to their ends. So in 2016, we saw different fake accounts that were part of like the Black Lives Matter movement. I think, I can go back and find their handles if y'all really want to know. I'll send them to you. But where it was building a following, trying to get into a community and then push the edges of that community. And that was a covert way of doing that. But as Dave said, we've now moved to the overt space. So if there is anything happening in the United States, and trust me, like there are days where like Russian state-backed media is not all that different from like the domestic media here. So don't want to overblow this. But if there can be, but what you will see are the absolute extremes of that coverage. And so it looks like it's all burning on both sides. And that's extreme on the right and extreme on the left. And so it's just that's a strategy of theirs. So I think a lot of times, and it sounds a little hokey, but like looking for the commonalities and drawing those out is actually a way to strengthen our communities. And you can't really do that on the national level. It's harder. I think it's really on the local level where that is going to be rebuilt.
I can just quickly piggyback on that. I think one of the commonalities that maybe traversed different diversity or diverse experiences, diverse cultural backgrounds in the United States has been sort of an overarching faith or commitment to our democracy. But I think that in spite of all the hardships that specific communities in this country have faced, where democracies actively worked against them, there was still this sort of commitment to democratic values. I see a moment now in our country where that has changed, and we are almost in like a post-democracy environment where there's no longer a shared belief that sort of the democratic foundations of this country are valid. And I hear in some segments of the media or some segments of the population sort of talking points about democracy that I would hear in Russia about democracy, or that I hear in Hungary in sort of a post-democracy, sort of pseudo-authoritarian state, where the state is sort of co-opting democratic institutions to become, what it essentially to like make it an authoritarian regime by sort of co-opting democracy for its own ends. And I see that now being parroted here in the United States. So there's no longer that sort of shared vision or shared belief in the democratic experiment. And I think that's different than what we've seen before. And the fact that it's becoming more sort of widespread and mainstream, I think is kind of troubling.
One area where I think we see this co-opting of supposedly shared language, but in ways that now different listeners will hear in very different ways, the very concept of the term election integrity.
Yes,
which to some people, as you say, that the head of CISA, independent observers looked at the 2020 election and said this was an absolutely reliable, well executed, exercise in democracy, in voting, in casting people's ballots, and in every ballot being counted. But the term election integrity, to many listeners, has become a tagline for implying that there's been fraud in the past, and that new intrusive measures that may limit the ability of some to cast votes are somehow needed. So the very use of the term election integrity sometimes now increasingly is used in order to create more doubt. So how do we work with that when we should be able to say, yes, we all want there to be election integrity, we all value this. What kinds of steps can different stakeholders be taking in order to push past the ways that disinformation and misinformation have sort of poisoned even some of the language through which we can talk about this?
That's such a good point. And I'll even just to kind of give you an example of that. I live in Virginia and got all the mailers somehow from the Republicans and the Democrats in this last election, and both were touting election integrity. But I'm pretty sure they meant different things to their different audiences. And so, it is a real challenge. I would say the same thing is happening to these very technical concepts like a post-election audit. Like the fact that as many people know what a post-election audit is and are talking about it as they are, it's concerning, just because it should be something that makes people feel good about the results of the election and verifies them. I don't, possibly a controversial opinion here, but I do think election observation of all sorts, and that includes, I think there's a little fear around Republican and party-backed election observation, and I think that some of that can be understandable, but I think really when you get down to it, let's vote, let's observe elections on both sides, and if we want more people doing that, I think that's a good thing. I was a poll watcher in California in 2010, you know, and it was part of what you did, volunteering for folks out there. So I'm a big believer in, you know, if you think something's going on, well, don't show up just out of the blue, but you know, go through proper channels, like get assigned a precinct, go check it out, and be a part of the process. Because I think when you are standing next to someone who is spending all day like checking people in and getting voters registered and making sure the process is working, and then turn around and start counting ballots, it's a lot harder to say that person you know, is doing something nefarious if you've been there all day and like you're kind of in it with them. So I think that's a real opportunity, and I you know, there's movement on that front across the board. There's also nonpartisan election observers, so I think there's a lot that can be done there. But what I think is more dangerous is just talking about things you think might be happening on the ground during elections, and that's not really helpful to anyone.
Election protection, right? I mean, then you also have folks there who are able to make sure people know their rights as a voter. And I worked on the Obama campaign in 2012, and I spent countless hours educating college students about voter ID, the threat of you know, voter ID laws, right? But yeah, I mean, that what you just said, it's common sense. It makes the process transparent. It makes people feel like they're included in it, so that we aren't hearing, you know, future Trump say, "Oh, just find a couple of extra ballots, and you know, maybe I can win," right? I mean, this is all common sense that leads to the strength and, again, fortified force of democracy.
Now, I want to make sure that we have time to open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to ask one last question for each of you to answer. And while all of you are listening to their answers, I also want you to be queuing up your own Q&A to get your questions ready to ask. But before we break and move to Q&A, I'm eager to hear some optimism, or at least some action items. So for any of the four regular citizens, and those are already beginning to emerge here, but for whether for different stakeholders, for regular citizens, what are the things we should be doing? And what's your wish list of actions that would be most impactful? So let's just move Rachael, David, and Morgan. Let's start here.
So I will say what's been an interesting shift for me over the last few years is how I view our leaders in Congress. I used to think that leaders led, right? They took people along with them, and I think it's very effective in historic situations. That's been the case. I think that's how McCain led a lot of times on the issues he really cared about, and you know, they took the public along with them. I think what we're seeing now is the public taking our politicians along with them in a different way. And so, you know, you get these more extreme people being elected to Congress, and that are really a product of demand. And so I think that's an interesting shift, but it's because those people are the most engaged, they're the most vocal, they're the most active. And this sounds like it's not hopeful, but it is, because I think we're starting to see that normal people are really fed up with this. I will give you an example just of bipartisan gun control legislation moving through the Senate for the first time in 30 years. And that wasn't because, you know, one gun lobby was really active, or it wasn't the normal groups. It was normal people started calling their Republicans started calling their Republican members of Congress, and said we've had enough. We don't know what the inability to compromise on this is, but move forward. And you see a lot of bipartisan legislation actually being discussed now in Congress after, you know, a pretty big stalemate for the last 2 years. So what I would say to you is, I think that when you do speak up, and when the middle that just cannot handle the noise on both sides, and I get it, when they're they're making their opinions and voices heard, it can be really powerful. And so that would be my biggest recommendation, is not to disengage and leave it to the loudest people.
I guess if I had a source of optimism, it's that the system didn't break in 2020. It could have, and didn't. And that was because of the integrity, to use a loaded term, of election officials who did their jobs as they were supposed to do. As I said, some were partisan officials, some were nonpartisan local election officials, who worked through whatever processes were in place, whatever irregularities may or may not have arose, and dealt with them. And the fact that these state and local officials were able to stand up to national figures and say the system worked, and even the partisan-led audits that came in and found no evidence of election manipulation, that, to me, that was a way of signaling to the American public this was all a bunch of nonsense. The system worked as it was designed to do. So that gives me hope that we have people with common sense at the community level working with and talking to members of their communities about sort of the basic pillar of democratic life in our country. That gives me some hope going into another fraught election cycle. In my mind, one of the biggest culprits of the morass we sort of find ourselves in as a citizenry is mass media and the mainstream media. And I know social media gets beaten over the head a lot, and they deserve it, but I'm not going to focus on them. I think, Rachael alluded to the fact that you don't really have national political figures as sort of the beacons of leadership that maybe they used to be, right? Sort of a unifying figure. And we have such a fragmented media ecosystem, but they have the ability, if they wanted to sort of leave the opinions and the inflammation of feelings aside and just present factual information to their constituencies if they wanted to. And I know that doesn't sell. I know it doesn't help ratings, but they also have a responsibility to their audiences to present facts and to present news and not just opinion. And what happened in 2020, there's a set of facts that ought to be agreed on as facts. There was not widespread election fraud. They have a responsibility to present that information factually. And my challenge then to that segment of democratic life is, do your job. That is also part of your job. And I think there would be a lot more consensus in American society if there were a little bit more consensus across the information ecosystem, the mainstream information ecosystem.
So that's a message to sort of media and politicians there.
Yeah, that is like the brain. I think the overarching thing I would say to everybody is just to not grow complicit and complacent. Don't think that, the loudest voices that we hear, oh, that's over there, that's on the fringes, because we see the threat of that becoming our norm and our mainstream, which is why please pay attention to this local election or these midterms. The fact that you are all here this evening shows that you're engaged. So I'm pretty sure you're all on top of it, but you're around people who most likely aren't all on top of it as you are. And you have access to those people. So ensure that they're registered to vote, of course, but it doesn't stop at voting, right? I always call voting a vitamin. It'll nourish you, but that can't be it, right? You got to eat your greens. You got to do the exercise. You got to do the work, right? So what does the work look like when it's not election day? And I think a lot of the times we just kind of sit back like, I did my job, my candidate won, or we can grow really depressed if our candidate doesn't win. So just be ready, right? Fortify yourself with information, and I was going to talk about please go beyond mainstream media. I mean, just expand your sources of information presently, but also be a scholar of history as well. I don't think we activate history enough, and if anything, people are trying to take it away in our country. Give yourself that knowledge to know where we came from so that we don't repeat it, because that's where we're at right now. Millennials, we are experiencing like the last 100 years all in the last 6 years. We all have a duty to act. Do so in a way that is most fulfilling and authentic to you, but in a way that brings other people along to the process.
So thank you all for that like call to action and call to arms. And let's now see if we can open it up to the broader room. And I don't know whether we can shift the lighting so we can, oh my gosh, like now. I spoke and there we were. So I don't know whether we need to give you handheld mics or whether we are magically mic'd so we can all hear. Do speak up loudly with your questions. And I think our colleagues here will be calling on people or will be gesturing to people.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
So I wanted to ask a question about media literacy and how do you determine what is a reliable source of information and what's not? And also, do you have some little checklist or something that people could put next to their computer while they're absorbing information that says, here are some warning signs. You know, if you're getting really angry, check it. Maybe if you're getting a little too comfortable, check it. And here's how to check it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to take that. So there is actually a group. It's tough, right? There's no perfect answer on this. I would personally encourage everyone, know who's funding your sources of information, and if you can't figure it out, that should cause some questions. Where that, what type of media organization it is. There are lots of like investigative, like sounds cool, but like you need to do a little digging on that. You know what the big media outlets are that are national outlets. I could have piled on. Today it's a little bit with, maybe the mainstream media should focus less on Marjorie Taylor Greene and more on some of the substantive work that's going on. So I do think there's like I get the frustration with the mainstream media, so I don't want to discount that. But there is an organization why am I blanking on it? Like Laura must know, that goes through and kind of rates the different outlets, and you can see their system. And
PolitiFact?
It's not PolitiFact does fact checking. It's not First Draft. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's It seems like y'all have a lot of good recommendations. I can't. First Draft is a great resource for reporters, and then I'm totally blanking on the names. That does exist, and anytime we do this again, I will have it at the ready.
How about Snopes? No.
No, I'm thinking of, but these are all great resources. So with that.
I'll actually just jump in here also to reiterate the importance of looking laterally. I think in the initial, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the emphasis on combating disinformation really focused on like dive deep into that web page and examine it carefully and look, see if it's a .org or a .com. And what researchers have found is that when people dive into a source, we look at the wrong cues. We're not very good judges of that. And rather, the crucial step is to encourage people to step back from that individual source and look laterally and check and see what's the balance of information out there on this topic and on this source. So to pull back and look at Wikipedia, look at Google, and look at the range of sources and the range of information about that source. So rather than diving in and trying to become an expert, pull back and see what the experts are saying. And that technique has been shown to be very effective, across ages, across ideologies, at really getting us out of that lizard brain and into the space of sort of reasoned acceptance of collective wisdom, which really does still exist. So do another question.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. One, I would add to your list of bad flunkies media. is a group which rates media organizations according to how much they're giving you straight information as opposed to opinion. That's the north-south axis. The other axis is it to the left or is it to the right of the American political spectrum? So at the top of the pyramid, it has Associated Press, UPI, things like that. Over on this side, you get things like InfoWars, you get low fact, big opinion. Over here, you get Polar Report, low fact, big on opinion. MSNBC is about halfway up the pyramid. Not only do they do that, but if you put up, it's a web-based source, and they keep updating it. If you click on whatever they have there, say NBC, it will show you individual ratings for 100 stories and say, this story was accurate, this story was not, this one was biased, this one was not. So that the thing you have on the main pyramid is linked to, it's the average of all the stories they do. For example, with my students, I basically tell them, if you're citing something that's in the bottom 2/3 of the pyramid, don't bother me. I'm not going to worry about it. And the amazing thing is, if you're near the top of the pyramid, there's not that much range left and right. Because they're busy with numbers and as you're saying, facts. People actually, if you can give it to me in numbers, it probably is something you can check. And that's something to think about. Secondly, I've been working on this myself for, as you can probably tell from the enthusiasm. I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago about I think the title of it was, there are 20 members of the US Congress who are Russian agents and don't know, and gave names. But anyway, the amazing thing, they all ended up being Republicans. Anyway, in any case, and I'm teaching a class in September on conspiracies in American politics and conspiracy theories. One of the things to keep in mind is this has been going on forever. Conspiracy theories, conspiracy thinking, this goes back to the founding of the Republic.
Thank you so much for that. I think that was also Morgan's point. Really appreciate it. You have a frame of question?
One, but it's radical. Let's get rid of elections. What would you think of the idea of let's getting rid of elections? I like democracy. I've written about this too. I like democracy. I hate elections.
All right,
Let's toss it back to the panel. Thank you.
let's toss this back to the panel
Sortition.
and get
You
reaction.
select your Congress by random selection, the same way you use it for a Powerball.
All right, with that Powerball option, panel.
Thoughts to share?
I don't know, maybe it's the old adage, like democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones. Kind of situation for me. I love elections. I love campaigns. I love politics, or I did it. It's a little rough right now, but and I think that there is real value to this country that comes from that. I think they're a little sick right now, but I'm not ready to throw them out.
Well, again, I'm not opposing democracy. I'm opposing elections. They're two very different things. Russia has elections.
Dave, your thoughts?
Russia has elections, but they're sham elections.
Yeah, well, that's what some people are saying about ours.
Well,
They're not.
they're not though.
I agree.
I think we had a panel explaining why.
Basically, all politicians are alike. Why should it bother?
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry.
I believe in free and fair elections, and not just the United States, but many of our Democratic allies and partners hold excellently conducted democratic elections, and I support those.
Yeah, Morgan, I mean, this is one of the points you were making, is actually pulling people into the process of not just voting, but being more engaged in and around elections, can really build resilience, can build people's faith in the system because then it's not an external to them system. It's something that's more of a personal experience.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know what else to say after that. I mean, it's the power of the people. That's what we have to preserve and protect. That's the beauty of elections. So what happens when we reimagine what that looks like when it's inclusive? That's what I want.
And appreciating the engagement we're seeing here, Dominic had a question.
Yeah, exactly. You briefly touched on the funding of the media. In Germany, where I'm from, there's governmentally owned media. So even if not a single person would listen, not a single person would read the stories, not a single person would watch the news, they'd still get money, they'd still get funding, and they'd still do the reporting. As far as I'm aware, there's no such thing in the US. Correct me if I'm wrong, but do you think that the non-existence of those options?
NPR.
Yeah, NPR.
It's over,
Okay.
only gets like 3% government funding, the rest are paid by us.
That's fair.
Right,
Yeah,
yes,
right.
I mean, it's not like we have a BBC.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, but do you feel that the creation of such an option would help combat the existing misinformation, or would broaden the possibilities of informing yourself?
I have a thought on this. Yeah, okay. So I feel like I keep sharing my thoughts first, so I will go last next time. But I think because it is not culturally what we've done here in the US, and given the distrust that's kind of going, like, I don't know if y'all saw the Department of Homeland Security tried to make a disinformation board, and it had a kind of stupid name, and unfortunately, like, I think it wasn't well explained. There were a lot of problems with the rollout, but it died very quickly due to, attacks on the Republican side and questions about, like, what is a disinformation board, and why is the government deciding? I mean, this is not what it was there for, but, like, why is the government deciding what's true or false? And I think that just that was not the purpose of the board, but that was the complaint. So with that kind of fear out there, I think it would not be the right time for a government funded media outlet. I just think there's a discomfort with that, but I'm open to disagreements.
You know, we're a paradoxical nation in many respects because the United States is also the home of Voice of America, which is a government-funded news organization that presents, I would argue, pretty unbiased news to foreign audiences. And I'd say some Americans have objections to the Voice of America, but by and large, especially during the Cold War, there's overarching consensus that was a force for good in the world. But to create that domestically, as Rachael just outlined, there is such a reflexive distrust of state-sponsored truth, right? And that is also informed by our history. As you are absolutely right, our history still sort of informs the present political situation, and I think it would be a really difficult phenomenon for Americans of all stripes. This is not just a Republican versus Democrat thing. I think it would be a hard thing for many Americans to get behind, even if we agree that it would be pretty benign, but.
And Morgan, your thoughts about, is there a role for local media? Because this is something that's not necessarily so increasingly we're seeing foundations nationally and locally, regional foundations, think about how do we step forward and support local media when what across the country, what had been a thriving local news ecosystem has just been hollowed out through, the decline of classified advertising, the rise of social media, and so on. So the question of what are the new models or new roles for local media that would be addressing some of these same desires that elsewhere may be handled in terms of national public media?
Well, I think journalism is a lost art, but there are still artists out here in communities, right? So I think, having a city paper or a public source, right? Having those outlets, and again, opening it up for everyday people to contribute, be part of the process, inform their communities, right? I mean, I sound like a broken record here, but again, it's about access information being part of the process, it being a transparent process. There's a lot of beauty in that. The Pittsburgh Courier has a long legacy of being a historic outlet for African American culture and news out of Pittsburgh, right? So, how else can we cultivate that to spread fact and truth, but bring everyday people into the process who are looking to be and refine that art of journalism?
We're getting a couple of questions online. I know Leo has a question. Is there a question over here? Okay, great. Perhaps you, then Leo, and then we'll turn to online questions.
Okay. Morgan mentioned or pointed out how hard it is to get national messages or maybe the goals of the Democratic Party to individual people, right? That's really hard. But the Russians have managed to get their overarching messages through to media people or psychologists through to the troll farms to get to U.S. sub-communities. And I'm wondering, Dave, if you know anything about the logistics of that. Like, who are these psychologists? How do they understand these little subcultures? Because they're affecting a lot of different groups of Americans. And how are they so much better at their messaging than we're able to counteract with?
I don't know if I know about those psychologists specifically, but I can speak from I previously worked for the State Department. I was a U.S. diplomat, and I can tell you that my Russian counterparts, many of them who worked in the United States, spent their entire careers devoted to studying the United States. So, we in our State Department, we bounced around the world every 2 to 3 years. They would devote 30 years to understanding us, and so there's a funnel from all sorts of people connected or affiliated with the Russian government who knew what people in Pittsburgh thought about the coal issue, and what people in San Francisco thought about the homelessness problem, right? And that's because they had such deep expertise living among us, studying us, taking advantage of our open society, and then feeding that to their troll farms, who would then pump out the content that was targeting segments of electors. So I don't know about the psychologists specifically, but I do know that there's a wealth of knowledge.
I didn't realize they stay in the U.S. I thought, like our system, they bounce around.
They do, but many of them are sort of, and this is true of a lot of diplomatic services. Like they specialize they really specialize in us. They're like U.S. experts, and that's one source of information that's sort of feeding into this well of content.
If I may, I'm going to stand on it because I'm tired of sitting. Real quick, you certainly raised the point, and I agree 100% that this issue has many, many sides to it. Very difficult to deal with, and certainly in our country right now, it seems to be very, very difficult to deal with. I'm going to talk about a little aspect of it you haven't mentioned, but I'm just curious to get your opinion on how much you think that too adds to the problem. For example, it was mentioned that you had worked for Senator McCain. Now, although different from my party, he certainly is that type of leader that you would look at, respect, follow, as the way you suggested, that you would follow that leader. Unfortunately, right now, with our system of gerrymandering, where elections are now being created, electors are being created that fit the needs of that elected official, so that he can continue or she can continue to get voted back into office again and again and again. My concern is some of the disinformation that we all hear not only comes from right-wing media or left-wing media, but they're also coming in many times now among our elected officials, those same people that we grew up respecting and believing in, and we ask our children and grandchildren to do the same. That's becoming more and more difficult because, again, these elected officials are pretty much mimicking what they know their constituents want them to believe and say. That, to me, adds to the dilemma of misinformation. Do you think, and I know it's not an easy chore either, but do you think that dealing with the areas of gerrymandering in this country could be at least a step in the direction of trying to get rid of that part of it, that small part?
couple weeks. So. I do. I don't really know what the solution is though. We look at that, but it's not a main area of focus on the work we do at ASD. But it's definitely a contributing factor to the partisanship. I don't think it fully explains it, but could we have, divvy up districts in a fairer way that makes more competitive races than we currently have? Yes, that would likely help. But I don't necessarily, with states in control of that process, I don't know how to do that, and I'm not necessarily in favor of federally, dictating how it's done. So that's probably a very unsatisfying answer. But yes, it could help. But I don't know how to do that.
I'm not an expert on gerrymandering or domestic politics for that matter, so I will purposely avoid that. But I will say, and this is not to champion sort of the complete reinvention of our electoral system, but I do think some of the parliamentary democracies that exist in the world have an advantage over our two-party system, because the systems in their inherent instability are somehow reinforcing like a more almost like sanitized or sane type of politics in a way, where people have more of a choice of the type of political party they can identify with. Like I don't really know at this point sort of which political party best represents my interest. And someone who's pretty squarely in the middle, centrist of sorts. I don't see that, and I see big tents in both parties, but both parties tend to be at times hijacked by their wings in our system, and I think gerrymandering is sort of a reflection of that radicalization of the two-party system in a way. And so I would love to see a third party movement emerge in this country. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a centrist party, although I would welcome that personally. But, I think that would help to undo some of the reinforcing tendencies that exist, like gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is there to essentially reinforce to the victor comes the spoils, right? And shaking that system up in a way would, I think, maybe I'm being naive, and that's fine if I am, but I think it would be a welcome attempt to try to push back against some of those tendencies.
I know growing up, I always had every time I heard gerrymandering, because we've seen it used to, adhere to the status quo for so long. But I mean, to your point, when we think about John McCain, it's oh yeah, only those Republicans, right? And now we're at a point that, we may have gotten Donald Trump out of the White House, but he's in our own backyard now, right? So what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? So I think we got a question.
The other questions online, the first is on the media diet, and the second is on trust. Do you think that the partial deplatforming of outlets like InfoWars, RT, and OAN is changing the political media diet at all, or are we too segmented for that to make a difference?
Here we go again. Okay. I'm I thought, but no. So I tend to be a little pessimistic on this one, that we are in fact so segmented. I think it can help with new, discovering new things. But I think if that's your what you are interested in and what you enjoy consuming, that you will find out where it is. But new converts wise, and as far as, I have a family. Oh, I shouldn't say this publicly. I know someone who has this great knack for finding the most obscure news sources that I don't know how we find these, but I'm going to be in so much trouble. But anyway, all I'm saying is sure it helps. I don't think it solves our problem.
The other question on trust is, how do you balance trying to increase trust and participation in democratic institutions and processes with raising awareness of entrenched government dysfunction? PA General Assembly is cited as an example.
I think both can coexist. I mean, you can't paint rainbows and butterflies picture, right? I mean, we want optimism and idealism, but in order for people to understand how it works, you gotta break it down and how it hasn't worked for us, right? Again, that's what my point earlier about being a scholar of history, right? You have to know where you came from to know where to go. So again, I don't think in binaries, I think things can coexist.
And I think there have been periods of dysfunction in American governance throughout our history. And you're right, it's only through citizen engagement, it's only through voting and,
Right.
Putting representatives in place who aren't going to be dysfunctional that you can sort of overcome the current climate of distrust. I think is possible. I think maybe it happens better in certain state assemblies than in Pennsylvania. I should know this as a native Pennsylvanian, but I don't know the current state of affairs in Harrisburg, but maybe there are other examples out there. But it's through participation in government that ultimately you get better governance.
I think we probably have time for one more question, or two at most. Yeah.
Thank you. So I keep coming back to the word authoritarianism, and that there are groups of people who are quite happy to believe the lies. They're quite happy and convinced that the election was stolen, all of that. I mean, I was a poll worker twice, and both times one person came in and said, "How do I vote Nancy Pelosi out?" And she was furious that wasn't an option on the ballot. And there's another person who came in and I said, "I know how those ballots work. When they pulled those ballots, it said Biden, 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 Biden." And we're like, wait, okay, if you want to vote, here's your ballot. This is how you fill it out. And you go over there. Someone was trying to walk her through what's called zero takes, that when the machines are first opened, it shows that no one has voted for everybody, and those tapes are posted. It was like, and I've heard that the more you try to say, well, here are the facts, here's how it actually works, they get more entrenched. So what do we do for the groups out there that do not live by fact and for whom reason and logic and conversation push them even further into their position? Because that to me really seems to be different from the past.
All you can do is provide information, because some people just can't be saved. And that's just the unfortunate fact, right? But as to your point of saying, okay, this is how you do it. I mean, they might have a come to Jesus moment later on, right? But that's a tough one. I mean, I'm glad I studied psychology in undergrad to understand how human behavior works sometimes. But just equipping people with information. But the point that when you first started talking, I thought about is that there's privilege in people thinking that way, right? That's your main concern. That's the hill that you're going to die on. Meanwhile, there's other people who literally their vote, their life is on the ballot, right? So again, providing the information might be the best that you can do. Hopefully they have poor family members in their family that can talk to them at Thanksgiving dinner because they have access to them. But I mean, unfortunately, it's so far beyond that. Fact is just on a different planet from where they reside. Not helpful, but the truth.
And I've talked to I'm just strategy, but I'm not changing minds here, but I know that it's gotten more intense for election workers and election officials. And I've talked to some election officials who, up one rung, they'd be like, I hear your concerns. I've shown you everything I can show you. If you have more complaints, talk to my supervisor. And I was told that the numbers never called, because it's not necessarily about getting an answer. It's about expressing something. which is that's not a good place to be if you're trying to have an actual conversation based on facts. So not terribly hopeful, but that is a strategy I've heard that works. The other thing in some situations that can be helpful is like asking questions about why do you think that? Where did you get this information? How exactly would that work? So that they're explaining as opposed to you trying to convince, and that can diffuse it a little bit. But I don't know in that situation that like you're going to be able to change minds.
They were not going to move from that position.
Yeah.
And I listened to another presentation about the misinformation and disinformation, and their suggestion was the more you try to have a discussion, and the more you say, "Oh, really? No, Nancy Pelosi's in California." That just pushes them further into their box. It's beyond reason and logic. It's something else.
Right.
And it's not just these individual people voting. It's the groups that are convinced Trump won and are unpersuaded by any of the testimony in the commission's hearings. And it's actively working to undo our institutions.
And make people like yourself less likely to volunteer, which
I'm volunteering. I never thought I'd have to be afraid.
Yeah.
I never thought poll workers in Georgia were threatened. Election workers in the Midwest were threatened, had people threatening their children.
In Philadelphia, Al Schmidt and his family had to have police protection. I mean, it is, and it's to the point where we saw in, where words become action with January 6th. And so like that is one of the biggest challenges is keeping election officials and election workers safe in these midterms.
Thanks. I'll just sum up for a second as we're drawing this to a close. Some of keeping enough of a space of safety that we can encourage people to step forward and participate in the political system is something that I keep hearing again and again, because the people are learning from their trusted interlocutors, from friends, from families, from members of their community, and the more that we can do to pull people into the process, to take concerns seriously, to make sure that people's to create transparency, not through distant cameras and 1,000 images on the internet in which people are scrutinizing for evidence, but to create transparency through face-to-face interactions and through the building of trustworthy relationships that connect elected officials or election workers to communities. That's got to be part of the solution. And in that, what I hear all of these things, that we all have a role to play, and also that we can't do it alone. Both of these things are true. So with that, I'm going to give a final thank you to the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, to the Alliance for Securing Democracy, to Pitt Cyber for this really important conversation, of course to City Theater for hosting us, and thank you to all of you for joining us in person, to those of you who have joined us online. And for those of you who are here in person, please stick around and continue talking in these last minutes that we have together. We really appreciate your being here and your interest in this vitally important topic. So thank you so much, and a round of applause for our panel.